Aristocracy, Eleanor Vance had concluded, was nothing more than well-dressed bankruptcy. The thought was a sharp, satisfying splinter in the opulent boredom of Lady Danbury's ballroom. From her carefully chosen alcove, partially concealed by a monstrous fern, she had a perfect view of the proceedings. It was a ledger book of humanity, and tonight, the accounts were deeply in the red. The air, thick with the cloying scent of hothouse lilies and the more subtle notes of desperation, felt heavy in her lungs. She watched the dancers twirl under the weight of 1,000 glittering crystals, a kaleidoscope of silk, satin, and jewels. It was a performance, a grand play where everyone knew their lines but had forgotten the meaning. The rustle of a silk gown was the turning of a page in a book of lies, the tinkle of laughter was the hollow chime of an empty vault. Eleanor catalogued it all with the dispassionate eye of an auditor. Her own gown, a deep emerald velvet, was a calculated investment. It was 3 seasons out of date, purchased second-hand and recut by her own hand to follow the current fashion. The worn velvet was soft against her skin, a familiar comfort. It was a costume, just like everyone else's, but hers was paid for in cash, not promises. This fact was a small, hard piece of armor she wore beneath the fabric. Her family's situation was a peculiar one. They were the Vances, a name with respectable, if not dazzling, lineage. But her father, a man with more pragmatism than pride, had seen the rot setting into the landed gentry and had done the unthinkable. He had gone into trade. Shipping. And he had been disgustingly, embarrassingly successful. They were now perched precariously on the edge of society, a chimera of old blood and new money, welcomed for their funds but disdained for their source. Eleanor smoothed a wrinkle from her glove. The leather was cool and supple. She had been here, in this very ballroom, 2 years prior. Then, she had been engaged to Lord Ashworth. Charming, handsome, weak-chinned Lionel. He had whispered promises to her under this very chandelier, his breath smelling of sweet wine and stale lineage. Then her father's first major investment had failed, a temporary setback, and Lionel had vanished like morning mist, his carefully worded letter of regret a masterpiece of cowardly prose. The initial wound had been sharp, a public humiliation that had left a scar not of sorrow, but of cold, hard clarity. She had not cried. She had instead opened a new ledger, her personal one, and tallied the cost. The cost of trust. The cost of believing in whispers in a ballroom. The debt was noted, the account opened. Her gaze drifted across the room, past the preening peacocks and fluttering hens, and landed on him. The Duke of Alastair. Lucien Beaumont. He was not dancing. He stood near the massive fireplace, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across his severe, handsome face. He was a study in stillness, a predator at rest. Tall and broad-shouldered, encased in a black coat that seemed to absorb the light, he was the undisputed apex of this fragile ecosystem. His legacy was a fortress, his title a weapon. Whispers followed him like a cloud of soot. His estate, Blackwood Manor, was said to be a masterpiece of Gothic architecture and crippling debt. The Duke, they said, was proud, aloof, and struggling to keep the ancient stones of his house from tumbling down around him. He was the ultimate symbol of his class, a magnificent ruin. And he was staring. Not at her, precisely, but in her general direction, his gaze sweeping over the lesser nobles with an air of profound disdain. Then, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, snagged on hers. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the vast, indifferent distance between a fern and a fireplace. Then, a flicker. A subtle shift in his expression. His eyes narrowed, cataloguing her, the slightly out-of-style velvet, the modest jewelry, the name and history he would undoubtedly know. He was reading her entry in his own mental ledger. A portly baron, eager for a ducal audience, puffed up beside him and murmured something, gesturing vaguely in Eleanor's direction. Eleanor could not hear the words, but she could read the language of sneering lips and dismissive gestures. The Duke's mouth tightened into a thin, cruel line. He spoke, his voice too low to carry, but the baron's subsequent bray of laughter was loud enough. The daughter of the shipping magnate, the baron guffawed, his voice carrying in a lull in the music. Trying to buy her way into a title, I hear. Like a merchant haggling for a new coat. The heat that rose in Eleanor's cheeks was not shame. It was fury. A white-hot, silent rage that made the ballroom and its occupants shrink into insignificance. The Duke did not laugh. He simply gave a slight, dismissive nod, a confirmation of the Baron's vulgar assessment. His gaze met Eleanor's again, this time with open contempt. It was a direct, calculated insult, delivered by proxy but authored by him. He was dismissing her, her father, their hard-won success, as little more than dirt on his polished boots. This was it. The confrontation she had not sought but had always known was possible. He was the embodiment of the world that had discarded her once and would gladly do so again. The world that valued moldering tapestries over balanced books. Eleanor did not look away. She held his cold gaze, letting him see the utter absence of fear in her eyes. The music swelled again, a jaunty waltz that felt like a mockery. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself away from the wall, leaving the relative safety of the fern. She walked not away, not in a hurried retreat, but towards the center of the room, her path taking her directly past the Duke and his snickering companion. She stopped before them. The Baron had the decency to look startled. The Duke simply watched her, his expression unreadable, a mask of aristocratic ice. Eleanor did not speak. Words were clumsy, easily misconstrued. Actions were precise. She sank into a curtsy. It was not a simple dip of the knees. It was a masterpiece of controlled motion, a slow, deliberate, and exquisitely executed gesture of respect that was so perfect, so flawless, it became an act of supreme insolence. She held it for a beat longer than necessary, her head bowed, the emerald velvet pooling around her on the floor. It was a curtsy that said, "I know the rules of your game better than you do, and I will use them to cut you." Then she rose, slowly, meeting the Duke's shocked gaze. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She did not flee the ballroom. She made a controlled, strategic exit, leaving the most powerful man in the room staring after her, a flicker of something new and unsettling in his cold, winter sky eyes. The war had been declared, not with a shout, but with a curtsy. And Eleanor Vance had just fired the first shot. The carriage ride home was a blur of rattling cobblestones and churning thoughts. The damp chill of the London night seeped through the cracks around the window, but Eleanor felt none of it. She was burning from the inside out, fueled by a cold, clean purpose. The humiliation had been a whetstone, sharpening her resolve to a razor's edge. Her father was waiting up for her in his study, a decanter of brandy at his elbow and a cloud of stale tobacco smoke hanging in the air. The scent of ink and old paper was a comfort. This was the source of their power, not some drafty, inherited castle. "Well," he asked, not looking up from the shipping manifest spread across his desk. "Did you secure us a marriage proposal from a half-wit earl with more debts than teeth?" His tone was wry, but there was a genuine question underneath. "No, father," Eleanor said, pulling off her gloves finger by finger. "I think I have identified a duke." That got his attention. He looked up, his sharp eyes taking in her flushed cheeks and the militant set of her jaw. "Danbury's only has one of those in attendance tonight. And he's famously uninterested in the daughters of shipping magnates." He made his disinterest quite clear, Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "He believes we are merchants haggling for a coat." Her father's face darkened. "He said that." He allowed it to be said. "It is the same thing." She walked to the window, looking out at the dark, sleeping city. "They are all the same, father. They build their houses on sand, on foundations of inherited glory, and they are shocked when the tide comes in. They call our work vulgar, but they are not too proud to spend the coin it generates." "So, this is revenge?" he asked quietly. "Revenge is a luxury, father. This is strategy." She turned back to him, her eyes gleaming. "The Duke of Alastair is drowning. Everyone knows it. His lands are mismanaged, his tenants are leaving, his creditors are circling like vultures. He has an asset I need, a title that will silence the whispers and solidify our family's position for generations. And I have an asset he cannot afford to refuse, a dowry large enough to float his entire crumbling dukedom." She began to pace, the velvet of her dress whispering against the floorboards. "It will not be a proposal. It will be a merger. A business transaction. I will present it as such. His pride for my fortune. His name for my security. It's a perfectly balanced equation." Her father leaned back, steepling his fingers. He recognized this look in his daughter. It was the same look he got when he was about to corner a rival in the tea trade or acquire a new shipping line. It was the look of a predator that had scented blood. He will never agree. His pride is all he has left. Pride doesn't pay stonemasons, Eleanor countered flatly. Or feed tenant farmers. Or hold off the men from the bank. His pride is a liability on his balance sheet, and I will convince him to liquidate it. I will draft the terms myself. A contract, ironclad and absolute. No room for sentiment. No space for loopholes. This was not the heartbroken girl jilted by Lord Ashworth. This was a woman forged in the fire of that humiliation. The pain had been burned away, leaving behind something harder, something stronger. Something that looked at the Duke of Alastair not as a man, but as a fortress to be besieged. And she had just found the crack in its walls. 2 days later, Eleanor presented herself at the Duke's London residence. She had not requested an appointment. To do so would be to ask for permission to place herself in a position of supplication. She simply arrived, her father's plainest but most well-appointed carriage a statement of serious, unadorned wealth. The butler, a man who looked as though he had been carved from a glacier, attempted to dismiss her. The Duke is not receiving visitors. I am not a visitor, Eleanor replied, her voice calm and level. She handed him a sealed envelope. I am a business proposition. Give this to him. I will wait. She was shown into a small, cold parlor. The furniture was exquisite but shrouded in dust covers, as if the house itself were in mourning. A tall, slender clock in the corner ticked with funereal slowness, each tick a grain of sand falling in the hourglass of the Beaumont legacy. The air smelled of lemon wax and decay. She waited for 47 minutes. It was a test, she knew. A petty display of power. She spent the time examining a faded tapestry, noting the frayed edges and the water stain in the corner. A perfect metaphor. When the door finally opened, it was not the butler. The Duke of Alastair stood there, her unsealed envelope in his hand. He looked taller in his own home, and even more forbidding. His face was a thundercloud. This is an insult, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He did not invite her to sit. The truth is often perceived as such, Eleanor responded, turning from the tapestry to face him fully. Which part did you find most insulting? The accurate assessment of your debts, or the practical solution I offered? He strode into the room, his fury a palpable force. You, a tradesman's daughter, have the audacity to come into my home and propose this transaction. He spat the word out as if it tasted foul. You would buy my title like a piece of horseflesh at market. A horse is a living, breathing thing, your grace. I am offering to purchase a name. A brand. And a deeply distressed asset, she said, her tone utterly reasonable. In return, I am offering solvency. I am offering you the means to repair that leaking roof, to pay your staff, to restore your family's honor in a way that matters, by making it solvent. He stopped a few feet from her, his height and anger meant to intimidate. Eleanor held her ground. She had faced down dockyard foremen with more genuine menace. My honor is not for sale. Excellent. Then we have nothing to discuss. Eleanor made a small move toward the door. I wish you the best of luck with your creditors. I hear Mr. Henderson is particularly persistent. She saw it then, a flicker of sheer panic in his eyes before it was banked by rage. She had him. The name of his most aggressive creditor had been a well-placed shot. What do you want? He bit out, the words torn from him. I want what is in the contract, she said simply. A marriage. Your title for my dowry. My name becomes Duchess of Alastair. Your ledgers become balanced. My family is secured. Your legacy is saved. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement. Emotion, I assure you, will not be a factor on my side. I expect the same courtesy from you. He stared at her, his mind clearly racing, weighing the crushing, tangible weight of his debts against the intangible, ruinous cost to his pride. He was a man trapped in a burning building, and she was offering him a ladder made of everything he despised. You are a viper, he breathed, the words a mixture of hatred and something that sounded almost like grudging admiration. Vipers are resilient, your grace. They adapt to their environment. She met his gaze without flinching. Do we have an agreement? He looked from her face to the contract in his hand, a document that represented the surrender of his world. The ticking of the clock filled the silence. Each second was a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his pride. Finally, with a look of profound self-loathing, he gave a single, sharp nod. The wedding was a quiet, frigid affair. A week later, they were man and wife, bound not by affection, but by a 9-page contract drafted by Eleanor herself. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in near total silence. It was a long, uncomfortable procession into the heart of her new, cold reality. If the Duke's London house had felt like a tomb, Blackwood Manor was a necropolis. The carriage rolled up a long, weed-choked drive, the ancient oaks overhead dripping with rain and moss, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the grey sky. The house rose from the mist, a vast, Gothic sprawl of dark stone, stained with age and neglect. Its windows were like vacant eyes, staring out at a landscape of bleak, rolling hills. The heavy oak door, studded with black iron, thudded shut behind them, the sound echoing through the cavernous entry hall. A damp chill, smelling of wet earth and centuries of dust, immediately settled into Eleanor's bones. This was her new home. Her prize. It felt like a prison. The Duke, her husband, did not offer her a tour. He gestured to a severe-looking woman in a black dress. "Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, will show you to your rooms. They are in the east wing. My own are in the west." The message was clear. A house divided. A marriage in name only. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice betraying none of the crushing disappointment she felt. Disappointment in what? She had not expected a warm welcome. She had not expected kindness. But the sheer, oppressive coldness of the place, and of him, was a physical weight. "I will be in my study," he continued, already turning away from her. "Do not disturb me." And with that, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down a long, dark corridor, leaving her alone with the housekeeper and the ghosts. Mrs. Gable looked at Eleanor with an expression that mingled suspicion and resentment. She was clearly a creature of the old Duke, loyal to the ruin and not to the woman who had come to save it. "This way, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, the title sounding like an accusation on her thin lips. Eleanor followed her up a grand, sweeping staircase, the worn velvet runner doing little to muffle the sound of their steps. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors watched them pass, their painted eyes seeming to judge and condemn her. Each one was a testament to the pride that had brought this house to its knees. They had overseen its glory, and now they would oversee its salvation at the hands of a merchant's daughter. The irony was so thick she could taste it, metallic and bitter like an old coin. Her rooms were vast, cold, and furnished with heavy, dark wood pieces that seemed to suck the very light from the air. A fire had been laid in the hearth but not lit. The bed was a monstrous four-poster, draped in faded, heavy fabric that smelled of damp wool. It was a room that had not seen genuine life or warmth in decades. "Will there be anything else?" Mrs. Gable asked, her hand on the doorknob, eager to be gone. "Yes," Eleanor said, turning from the window that looked out onto a rain-slicked, dying garden. "I will require the estate ledgers for the past 5 years. And a full accounting of all staff, their duties, and their wages. And any and all outstanding bills and correspondence from creditors. Have them brought to me here. Immediately." The housekeeper's eyes widened in shock. She had expected tears, perhaps. A fit of feminine hysterics. She had not expected a command for the account books. But "His Grace handles the books," she stammered. "His Grace has just acquired a partner in that endeavor," Eleanor replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I am the Duchess now. This is my house. And I intend to know its every weakness. Starting with the numbers. See to it." Mrs. Gable scurried away, and Eleanor was left alone in the echoing silence. She walked to the unlit fireplace and pressed a hand against the cold, carved marble of the mantel. This was her battlefield. The ledgers were her maps, the numbers her soldiers. The Duke thought he had sold his name. He had no idea he had just acquired a general. The siege of Blackwood Manor had begun. The ledgers arrived an hour later, a teetering stack of dusty, leather-bound volumes delivered by a footman who looked terrified to be in her presence. They smelled of ink and failure. Eleanor cleared a large table by the window, rolled up the sleeves of her practical traveling dress, and began to work. For the next 2 weeks, Eleanor barely left her rooms. She had her meals brought on a tray, simple fare she ate while poring over columns of figures. The numbers told a grim, predictable story, of lavish spending on frivolities decades ago, of dwindling rents from tenants on unimproved lands, of loans taken at ruinous interest rates to cover other loans. It was a tapestry of mismanagement, woven with threads of pride and neglect. The Duke, for all his aristocratic bearing, was a catastrophic businessman. She cross-referenced the household accounts with the estate expenses. The waste was appalling. The kitchens were ordering 3 times the amount of meat needed for the skeleton staff and the 2 occupants of the house. The wine cellar was still being stocked with expensive French vintages. It was as if the house were trying to maintain the illusion of wealth long after the reality had crumbled. Eleanor started making lists. She drafted new, leaner menus with the cook, a woman who was initially hostile but became a grudging ally when Eleanor pointed out her budget would now be smaller but consistent, with no fear of suppliers going unpaid. She calculated the cost of repairing the tenants' cottages versus the lost income from them sitting empty. Investment versus loss. It was a simple calculation, but one no Beaumont had apparently made in a century. Her only ventures out of the East Wing were to the library. It was the one room in the house that felt alive. Thousands of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, a silent testament to generations of scholarship. The air smelled of old leather and paper, a scent she loved. It was here, one evening, that she finally encountered her husband again. He was standing by the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. He did not seem to have noticed her entry. He looked exhausted. The proud, arrogant mask he wore in public had slipped, revealing a man crushed by the weight of his own history. For the first time, Eleanor saw not the Duke of Alastair, but Lucien Beaumont, a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. She moved silently to a shelf, looking for a book on modern crop rotation. Her hand brushed against a worn leather spine. "What are you doing?" His voice, when it came, was raspy, tired. "I was under the impression this was a library," she replied, not turning around. "I am availing myself of its resources." "I meant at Blackwood. In my house." "Our house," she corrected him gently, finally turning, a heavy book in her hands. "And I am doing what I said I would do. I am saving it." She held up the book. "I'm starting with the West pasture. The soil is depleted. A 3-year rotation with clover and turnips should restore it. In the meantime, we can lease the fallow land for grazing sheep. It will bring in a small but steady income." He stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "You've been reading about crop rotation. And drainage. And tenant housing contracts. And the market price for wool in Yorkshire." She walked over to the large library table and laid the book down. "Your estate is not a force of nature, Your Grace. It is a business. And it has been run into the ground." Instead of the anger she expected, a look of bitter resignation crossed his face. He drained his brandy in one swallow. "And you, the merchant's daughter, are here to teach me how to count my pennies." The words were meant to be an insult, but they lacked conviction. They sounded like the last gasp of a dying prejudice. "I am here to teach you how to make pounds, not count pennies," she retorted. "There is a difference. Your family has been living off its capital for 100 years. It's a strategy that always ends in bankruptcy. I intend to make this estate generate income again." He was silent for a long moment, watching her. From his study window in the West Wing, he had seen her. He had watched her walking the grounds with the estate manager, a man who had served his father, pointing at broken fences and waterlogged fields. He had seen the lights in the East Wing burning late into the night. He had seen the stacks of ledgers. He had expected her to fill the house with gaudy furniture and loud friends, to try and remake it in her own image. Instead, she was working. She was treating his ancestral home not as a backdrop for social climbing, but as a complex problem to be solved. It was baffling. It was infuriating. And it was, to his deep and profound horror, a little bit impressive. She moved with a purpose he had not seen in anyone, least of all himself. She was not a viper. She was a physician, and his dying home was her patient. "The West pasture," he said, his voice rough, "has always been used for grazing the household's horses." "The 3 horses that remain?" Eleanor asked, raising an eyebrow. "They seem quite content in the smaller paddock by the stables. A paddock that, I might add, could be more productively used to grow vegetables for the kitchens, saving us nearly £200 a year. She knew. She knew the exact number of horses they had left. She knew the cost of their upkeep. She knew everything. He felt a sudden, dizzying sense of being seen, of his failures being laid bare and catalogued by this calm, infuriatingly competent woman. He said nothing more. He simply poured himself another brandy and returned to staring at the fire. Eleanor went back to her book. They remained that way for over an hour, two solitary figures in the vast, silent library, separated by a chasm of class and history, but sharing, for the first time, the same heavy air of exhaustion and responsibility. It was not peace. But it was a truce. A crack in the armor of their Cold War. The thaw, like a tentative spring, was beginning. The first true sign of change came not from a ledger book, but from a letter. It arrived on a crisp autumn morning, delivered by a special courier from London. Eleanor was in the estate office, a small, dusty room she had commandeered near the kitchens, when the Duke stormed in. He did not knock. He threw the letter onto the desk in front of her. His face was pale, his usual cold fury replaced by something colder, dread. "Read it," he commanded. Eleanor picked it up. The parchment was heavy, the seal that of a prominent member of Parliament, a man known to be the Duke's political rival. The letter was short, vicious, and to the point. It was a notice that Lord Harrington was calling in a significant, privately held debt, one that Lucian had secured with a personal guarantee against lands that were not part of the main estate. Harrington knew the Duke could not pay. It was a calculated move to force a default, to publicly humiliate him and seize a strategically important parcel of land that bordered Harrington's own. This wasn't in the ledgers, Eleanor said quietly, reading the damning figures. The debt was immense. Her dowry had shored up the walls, but this was a cannonball coming straight through the main gate. It was a gambling debt, Lucian bit out, pacing the small room like a caged wolf. My father's. A matter of honor. I assumed the obligation when he died. He stopped and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound weariness. Harrington has been waiting for the opportune moment. He wants to see me ruined. Utterly. This was it. The burden revealed. The full, crushing weight of his legacy was not just financial neglect, it was a web of his father's sins, a collection of hidden traps waiting to spring. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw no pride in his eyes. Only desperation. He had come to her not as a duke demanding deference, but as a man out of options. Eleanor's mind, cool and quick, began to work. She tapped the letter with a long, slender finger. Harrington's power comes from his control of the eastern trade routes, correct? His consortium imports silks and spices. Lucian looked confused by the non sequitur. Yes. What of it? My father's ships control the western routes. But he has associates. In Amsterdam. In Lisbon. She stood up and walked to the large map of the world that hung on the wall, a relic from a more adventurous Beaumont ancestor. Her finger traced a path across the ocean. Harrington's next shipment of raw silk is due to leave Calcutta in 3 weeks. The price is negotiated, but the shipping contract is not yet finalized. It would be a shame if a new, more aggressive competitor suddenly entered the market. A competitor willing to undercut the established rates by, say, 20%. A dawning understanding lit Lucian's eyes. You could do that. My father could. And he would, if I asked him. It would cost Harrington a fortune. Enough to make him reconsider the wisdom of antagonizing our family. She used the word deliberately. Our family. She was offering him not a bailout, but a weapon. A strategic counterattack using the very tools of commerce he had so long disdained. She was turning her ledger book nature into an instrument of war on his behalf. The dynamic in the room shifted, subtly but irrevocably. They were no longer debtor and creditor, husband and wife in name only. They were allies. Write to him, Lucian said, his voice low and intense. Tell your father what to do. I will, Eleanor replied. But this has a cost. Not in money. In shifting our resources, my father will be exposed to risk. This is a significant move. I understand, he said, and she knew that he did. He understood the language of risk and consequence. That night, a storm broke over Blackwood. It was a furious, violent tempest, lashing the old house with wind and rain. Eleanor was in her room, drafting the careful, coded letter to her father, when a frantic knock came at her door. It was the estate manager, his face white with fear. "Your Grace, it's the old dam. At the north end of the valley. The water is rising too fast. If it breaks, it will flood the entire lower village." Before Eleanor could even process the words, the Duke was there, shrugging on a heavy oilskin coat over his shirt. He must have heard the commotion from the west wing. He looked at Eleanor, his expression grim. "Stay inside. It's no place for you." But Eleanor was already pulling on her sturdiest boots. "Those are your tenants, and my responsibility. I am coming." The scene at the dam was chaos. Lanterns swung wildly in the wind, casting long, dancing shadows. The roar of the rising water was deafening. Men shouted, their voices swallowed by the storm. The earthen dam was weeping, water seeping through in a dozen places. Lucian was in the thick of it, his ducal authority forgotten, replaced by the raw command of a leader in a crisis. He was directing men, hauling sandbags, his face set in grim lines, his fine shirt plastered to his body with rain and mud. Eleanor did not stand on the sidelines. She saw the disorganization, the panic. She grabbed the estate manager. "Where are the extra shovels? And the empty grain sacks? We need more sandbags. And get the women from the village organized. They can make coffee and bring dry clothes." She moved with a calm efficiency that cut through the panic. She organized a chain of men and women, passing sandbags down the slippery bank. She was soaked to the skin within minutes, the heavy fabric of her skirt clinging to her legs, mud sucking at her boots. She worked alongside them, her hands, accustomed to pens and needles, becoming raw and scraped as she hauled rough burlap sacks. At one point, a large section of the bank began to give way. A young boy, no older than 12, slipped and began to slide toward the churning water. Without a thought, Lucian lunged, grabbing the boy and shoving him back to safety, but losing his own footing. He slid down the muddy embankment, his leg twisting awkwardly, his body slamming against a half-submerged log. Eleanor saw it happen. She scrambled down the bank after him, ignoring the shouts of the other men. He was trying to get up, his face contorted in pain. "My leg," he gasped, as she reached him. "I think it's broken." Together, with the help of 2 other men, they managed to get him back up the bank and into the relative shelter of a large oak tree. The rain was finally easing, the storm having spent its fury. The dam, for now, was holding. Eleanor knelt beside him in the mud. She ripped a strip from her already ruined petticoat and, after checking his leg as gently as she could, began to bind a makeshift splint using a piece of fallen branch. Her touch was firm, practical, and utterly focused. When she was done, she looked up at him. His face was pale in the flickering lantern light, his hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes, however, were clear, and they were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen before. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet but sincere. Eleanor just nodded, her own exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. She noticed a dark smudge on his cheek. Without thinking, she reached out and wiped the mud away with her thumb. Her fingers were cold and scraped, his skin was surprisingly warm beneath the grime. It was a simple, functional gesture. A protective touch, devoid of romance, born of a shared ordeal. But in the space between them, it felt like a seismic event. The last of the ice around her heart cracked. The Duke of Alastair, the proud, imperious aristocrat, looked at the pragmatic heroine, the merchant's daughter, and for the first time, they saw not their roles, not their bargain, but each other. 2 people, covered in mud, who had just saved a village together. The London season was a necessary evil. 2 months after the storm, with Lucian's leg healed and Lord Harrington's ambitions thoroughly thwarted by a sudden and catastrophic collapse in the Calcutta silk market, they had to go. Rumors of Blackwood's revival were beginning to circulate, but so were whispers about the strange, reclusive Duchess and the state of the ducal marriage. They needed to present a united front. The Duchess of Devonshire's annual ball was the pinnacle of the social calendar, a glittering arena where reputations were made and destroyed. As Eleanor stood before the mirror in their London townhome, she felt as though she were donning armor for a battle. The gown was a deep, midnight blue silk, a creation of her own design, elegant and severe. Around her neck was a heavy diamond necklace, a piece from the Beaumont vaults that had been locked away for decades. Lucian had insisted she wear it. "It is a symbol of your station," he had said, his voice neutral. But as he had fastened the clasp, his fingers had brushed the nape of her neck, a brief, shocking touch of warmth on her cold skin. The unintentional intimacy of the moment had left her breathless. Entering the ballroom was like diving into a sea of sharks. The music, the light, the perfume, it was all a beautiful, predatory facade. Every eye was on them. On him, the resurrected Duke, looking more powerful and imposing than ever. And on her, the mysterious, low-born Duchess. The whispers were a physical presence, a rustling in the air just beneath the strains of the orchestra. "Look at her," a voice hissed from behind a fan. "Hardly looks the part, does she? All that new money can't buy grace." Eleanor's back stiffened, but she kept the serene, faintly bored expression she had perfected. She was a fortress, and their petty words were nothing but wind. Lucian, at her side, placed a hand on the small of her back. It was a possessive, protective gesture, a public declaration. His touch was a steady, warm pressure through the silk of her gown. "Ignore them," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. "They are gnats, buzzing around a lion." For the first part of the evening, they were unassailable. The Duke's sheer presence, combined with the undeniable splendor of the Beaumont diamond sparkling at his wife's throat, kept the more overt attacks at bay. They danced a single, formal waltz. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her with a firm, confident hand. For those 3 minutes, in the circle of his arms, the rest of the world faded away. There was only the music and the startling intensity of his gaze. The attack, when it came, was not from a rival duchess or a spurned debutante. It came from Sir Reginald Plymstock, a petty sycophant and a minor landowner who had once tried to secure a loan from Eleanor's father and been flatly refused. He was a man whose ambition far outstripped his intellect, a dangerous combination. He cornered Eleanor near the refreshment table while Lucian was speaking with a cabinet minister. Plymstock was slightly drunk, his face flushed with wine and self-importance. "Your Grace," he began with a bow that was more of a sneer. "A remarkable transformation. I must say, I never thought I would see Blackwood Manor restored. One must applaud the efficacy of trade." It was a veiled insult, wrapped in the guise of a compliment. Eleanor gave him a cool smile. "Indeed, Sir Reginald. It is amazing what can be accomplished with sound investment and a refusal to do business with unreliable partners." The shot hit its mark. Plymstock's face darkened. He dropped the pretense of civility. "And are you enjoying playing at being a duchess?" he asked, his voice rising, drawing the attention of those nearby. "Does it feel so very different from haggling over shipping rates in your father's counting house? Tell me, did you inventory the Duke's assets before you signed the contract, or did you take him on faith?" The small circle around them fell silent. This was more than gossip, it was a public, deliberate humiliation. It was the Baron's jibe from that first ball, sharpened and delivered directly to her face. The old wound, the one she thought had scarred over, throbbed with fresh pain. She opened her mouth to deliver a retort, a cold, cutting remark that would put him in his place. But she never got the chance. "That is quite enough, Plymstock." Lucian's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of ice. He had appeared at her side as if from nowhere. His face was devoid of expression, a lethal calm that was far more terrifying than any show of anger. He took a slow step forward, forcing Plymstock to take a step back. "You seem to be under several misapprehensions. Allow me to correct them." The entire ballroom was watching now. The music had faltered to a stop. "First," the Duke continued, his voice resonating with cold power, "you will address my wife, the Duchess of Alastair, with the respect she is due. Or you will not address her at all." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Second, you speak of her playing at being a duchess. Let me be clear. For 200 years, my family has been playing at being aristocrats, living on borrowed time and fading glory. We were a house built on sand, a ruin waiting to collapse. We spoke of honor while our tenants starved and our lands decayed." He turned his gaze from Plymstock to the assembled crowd, his voice rising to carry to every corner of the vast room. "This woman," he said, and he reached out and took Eleanor's hand, his grip firm and warm, "did not play at anything. She worked. She took the tangled, bankrupt mess of my legacy and, with an intelligence and a strength of character that none of you could possibly comprehend, she rebuilt it. She balanced ledgers you could not read. She managed lands you would not recognize. She saved my tenants. She saved my home. She saved my honor. He turned back to the now trembling Sir Reginald. You mock her father's counting house. I tell you now, there is more honor and value in one of her father's ledgers than in all the empty titles in this room combined. The Duchess of Alastair is the best thing to ever happen to my family and my name. She is the foundation upon which the future of Alastair will be built. You, sir, are a footnote. An irrelevance. And you have just insulted the one person in this room whose character is beyond reproach. He let go of Eleanor's hand and took another step toward Plymstock. You will apologize to my wife. And then you will leave. And if I ever see you in London society again, I will personally ensure that your creditors, of which I know you have many, become as persistent as you are obnoxious. Plymstock, white as a sheet, mumbled a terrified, incoherent apology in Eleanor's direction before practically fleeing the ballroom. A stunned, absolute silence remained. Lucian turned back to Eleanor. In front of everyone, he took her hand, raised it to his lips, and kissed it, not with the flourish of a courtier, but with the simple, profound reverence of a man honoring his queen. "Shall we go home, your grace?" he asked, his eyes holding hers. "Yes, Lucian," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "Let's go home." They walked out of the ballroom, not in defeat, but in triumph. The whispers that followed them now were not of derision, but of awe. The petty sycophant was ruined. The Duke and his merchant duchess were no longer a curiosity, they were a power, unified and absolute. The carriage ride back to the townhome was silent. It was not the cold, awkward silence of their journey to Blackwood, nor the exhausted silence after the storm. This was a silence heavy with unspoken emotion, charged with the aftershocks of the battle they had just won. Eleanor sat beside Lucian, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it. She didn't dare look at him. She was afraid of what she might see in his eyes, and more afraid of what he might see in hers. When they arrived, the house was quiet. The staff had been dismissed for the night. Lucian led her up the stairs to their private chambers, the air thick with anticipation. They had maintained separate wings of the house, a physical manifestation of their contract. But tonight, he did not turn toward his own rooms. He followed her to the door of her suite. Inside, a single lamp cast a warm, golden glow over the room. Eleanor felt a sudden, uncharacteristic nervousness. She moved to the dressing table and made a show of unclasping her earrings, her hands fumbling slightly. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. "I can't reach the clasp," she said finally, her voice a near whisper. She was talking about the heavy Beaumont diamond necklace. It felt like a lead weight around her throat, a symbol of the public role she had just played. She heard him move behind her. He stood so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His reflection joined hers in the mirror. He looked tired, but the lethal calm was gone, replaced by an unguarded vulnerability that mirrored her own. His hands came up, cool and steady. He did not touch her skin, his fingers working deftly at the intricate clasp. The act was one of gentle care, a deliberate removal of the symbol of her public duty, a transition from the Duchess of Alastair back to Eleanor. When the necklace came free, she felt a profound sense of release. He laid the glittering cascade of diamonds on the table beside them. "Lucian," she began, turning to face him. "What you did tonight." "I only spoke the truth," he interrupted, his voice low and raw. "A truth it has taken me far too long to see." He reached out, not to touch her, but to trace the edge of the contract she had drafted, which she still kept in a box on her desk. "I was a fool. A proud, arrogant fool." "You were a product of your world," she offered, a gesture of grace. "No," he insisted, finally meeting her eyes. His were dark, intense, filled with a regret so profound it stole her breath. "That's an excuse. The day you came to my house with this proposal, I was terrified. Not of you. Of what you represented. You were competent. You were practical. You saw the world as a set of problems to be solved, not a stage for playing out inherited roles. You represented a world that was rendering me and everything I stood for obsolete." He took a step closer. My insult, that first night, it was not aimed at you. It was an act of fear. I was a king in a crumbling castle, and I was lashing out at the person who had the gall to point out the cracks in the walls. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, and for the first time, she did not fight them. And she confessed, her voice thick with emotion, I came to you seeking not just security, but a strange sort of vengeance. I wanted to prove that my world, the world of ledgers and logistics, was superior to yours. I wanted to make you dependent on the very thing you scorned. And did you? He asked softly. Yes, she admitted. But somewhere along the way, somewhere between the dusty account books and the mud by the dam, the strategy became something else. The fortress I was besieging started to feel like a home I was defending. He reached out then, and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were rough, calloused from weeks of working alongside his tenants to repair the storm's damage, but his touch was incredibly gentle. Eleanor, he breathed, the sound a prayer. It is a home. Because you are in it. And then, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the chaste, formal peck of their wedding day. It was not a kiss of passion born of a whim or a fleeting attraction. This was the first true kiss of their lives. It was heavy, and grounded, and real. It was a confirmation of everything that had just been said, a sealing of a new contract written not on paper, but on their hearts. It was a kiss of equals. Of partners. It tasted of regret and redemption, of forgiveness and a future they would build together. When he finally pulled away, they rested their foreheads against each other, breathing the same air, their separate battles finally over, their shared life just beginning. 1 year later, spring had come to Blackwood Manor. It was not the tentative, hesitant spring of the year before, but a riot of confident life. The gardens, once dying and neglected, were a tapestry of vibrant color. The west pasture, now lush with clover, was dotted with fat, contented sheep. The sounds of hammering and cheerful shouts from the direction of the newly repaired tenant cottages drifted on the warm breeze. The house itself seemed to have exhaled, the stone no longer looked gray and grim, but warm and golden in the afternoon sun. Inside, the great house was filled with light. The dust covers were gone, the air no longer smelled of decay but of fresh flowers and lemon wax. Laughter, a sound Blackwood had not heard in a generation, echoed in the halls. In the estate office, the room Eleanor had once commandeered as her command post, the Duke and Duchess of Alastair were working. They sat not on opposite sides of the desk, but side by side, their heads bent over the same ledger. The book was not filled with red ink and desperate figures, but with neat columns of black, showing a modest but steady profit. Lucian pointed to a line item. The yield from the North Fields is up 17%. Your crop rotation scheme was more successful than even you predicted. There was a deep and genuine admiration in his voice. Eleanor smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. Our crop rotation scheme, you mean? You were the one who convinced the tenants to try it. I merely translated your logic into a language they understood, he countered, his own smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He had learned to smile a great deal in the past year. The aloof, imperious Duke was gone, replaced by a man who was no less commanding, but whose authority now stemmed from respect and partnership, not just birthright. He was still a lion, but he had found his lioness. He closed the ledger with a soft thud, the sound of a chapter successfully concluded. The work is done for the day, I think. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The faint scars from her work during the storm were still there, a reminder of the night their partnership was forged in mud and desperation. He treasured those scars. I suppose the estate can run itself for an hour or two, she agreed, leaning into him, her head resting on his shoulder. It was a familiar, comfortable position for them now. They sat in companionable silence, looking out the window at the thriving land spread before them. The political threats had vanished. The debts were settled. The ruin was a memory. Their joint efforts had not just saved Blackwood, they had transformed it into a living, breathing home, a testament to the powerful alchemy of their union. Lucian pressed a soft kiss to her hair. Do you remember what I said to you, that first day in the library? He asked quietly. I accused you of being here to teach me how to count my pennies. I remember, she murmured. And I told you I was here to teach you how to make pounds. You taught me more than that, he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was no longer strange to him. You taught me what value truly is. It isn't in a name, or a title, or a house. It's here, he squeezed her hand. It's in the work of our hands, the respect of our people, and the love of a partner who is your equal in every way. Eleanor turned her head, her lips finding his in a kiss that was gentle, loving, and as steady and reliable as the foundation they had built together. It was a quiet, tender moment, a promise not of a fairy tale ending, but of a lifetime of shared sunrises, balanced ledgers, and enduring love. Theirs was a partnership forged in strategy, tested by adversity, and finally, blessedly, redeemed by love. And in the quiet warmth of Blackwood Manor, it was more than enough.